Great. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Adna Karamehich Oates. I'm with the Open Government Partnership. Thank you for joining us today in this conversation about access to justice and open government during a pandemic. We're going to be getting started really soon, but I just wanted you for the beginning to please share with us who you are, where you're joining from. You can find the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to hear where everybody is from, and we'll be getting started shortly. Great, we have Imru from Morocco, Natalie from Justice Canada, hello. Nick from the World Bank in Washington, DC, hello. Ken from Australia, a lot of familiar names. Hi, Janet. So yeah, the numbers are increasing. We'll just wait a few more minutes. In the meantime, I just want to point out you have a screen. You should be seeing a screen with information about interpretation instructions. So we are excited to be able to offer English, French, and Spanish interpretation for this conversation today, but you do have to be using Zoom desktop or mobile app to access this feature. And you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a language or interpretation button. So select your preferred language. Just looking at some of the additional Kausar. We have Adelusi from Nigeria, Alvaro from Argentina. Hi, Alvaro. From Slovenia, great. We have a lot of good attendance. I'm going to be turning over to our moderator, Matthew Burnett, very shortly. But just as background, again, this conversation about access to justice and open government during a pandemic is part of the Open Response, Open Recovery campaign by the Open Government Partnership, during which we are facilitating conversations around government responses to the coronavirus and highlighting the ways in which transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and public participation can make a difference. And we're looking forward to a good exchange. Okay, we have Joanne from LADA in DC, Marlon, hi Marlon from Namati, Sophie from Canada, good turnout from Canada today. Hi, Mariano from Argentina. Julia from London. Great. So I'm going to now turn it over to Matthew Burnett from the Open Society Justice Initiative. We're really grateful that OSJI is co-organizing this conversation today with the Open Government Partnership. And Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, Adna, and welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Open Society Justice Initiative and the Open Government Partnership, we want to thank you for joining us, and particularly in these unprecedented times. As Adna said, today's session is part of a series of discussions that OGP has organized this week, which would have typically been Open Government Week in person in normal times. In addition to today's webinar on access to justice, there have been parallel discussions happening about open spending and budgeting, open data and access to information, health services, and later today, there's a session on digital governance. So in case you're interested in joining that one, you can do that and register on the OGP website. All of the webinars are being recorded, so you can watch them at your leisure, and they'll be available as well on the OGP website. We wanted to start with a few logistical reminders. As with the other webinars, this one's being recorded and it might be shared on social media. If you're using social media today, please use hashtag open response and hashtag open recovery in your posts. Given that there are many of us on the calls today, we also ask that you follow our guidance. There's interpretation available, and as Adna mentioned, we hope that you'll make expansive use of the chat function to add comments and share experiences, ask questions, and so on. By default, all of you are going to be on mute to ensure a smooth webinar without background or noise or distractions. The moderators will unmute you if we're able to bring you into the conversation. Otherwise, you should be using the chat box, and we'll be sure to be as responsive as we can to questions that come up. Turning to the webinar for today, we're hoping the discussion is going to identify concrete ideas and recommendations on how countries can deliver more effective justice solutions for citizens, not only during this difficult time, but also beyond. We hope that you can use the lessons you learned today during this time to improve justice systems and the services they provide, so that more people, and particularly the most vulnerable in our communities, benefit from protections afforded under law through increased access to justice and awareness of rights. OGP's platform of co-creating action plans jointly by civil society and government reformers is an excellent mechanism for this, and we have seen many OGP partners put forward justice-related commitments in their action plans that have lasting impact on creating more transparent and participatory and accountable governments. Highlighting these achievements as an example, OGP's Access to Justice paper, which was issued last fall, discusses and analyzes commitments from countries like Argentina and North Macedonia and Indonesia. The goal for today is to provide additional examples of justice-related initiatives and interventions and that OGP members can take inspiration from and build into their own action plans. It's really our privilege today to be joined by experts from across the globe who can share their work and improve access to justice, and specifically the ways in which they responded to the COVID-19 crisis. To that end, join me in welcoming 4 panelists. First, we'll have Susan McDonald, who is a principal researcher at the Department of Justice Canada, Lydia Winke Kembabazi, who is the legal manager at Avocade in Sierra Leone, Mohammed Nabi Wakar, who is the Afghanistan country director at the ILF, and finally Denise Dora, who's executive director at Article 19 South America and a board member of several Brazilian organizations, including Themis, whose work today she'll discuss. All of their impressive bios should appear in a link that's now being shared in the chat box, so you can read more about each of the presenters. And finally, just before we kick things off, we wanted to flag a couple of OGP resources that will also be posted into the chat. The first one is OGP's policy page, and that includes a link to the OGP paper that I just mentioned. And the second is OGP's guide to open government and the coronavirus, focused on justice. So both of those links should appear in the chat. All right, let's get started. And again, please make liberal use of the chat function to share your questions and insights. We're hoping that this presentation will be dynamic and responsive to the issues and interests that you have in joining us. We'll start in Canada, which has been instrumental in launching an OGP coalition on justice with other self-selected governments like Argentina and North Macedonia and Indonesia, as well as with civil society and private sector actors and multilateral organizations. Susan, Statistics Canada has been developing a legal needs survey, which OGP also profiled in its Access to Justice paper. Can you share a little bit with us about the scope of that legal needs survey and also the broader impacts of justice measurement in Canada?
Thanks, Matthew. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Actually, this is such a great opportunity for us to share about the work that we're doing. And as I was reviewing the guide to open government and the coronavirus and the justice and the recommendations under open response and data collection, I'm actually really excited to say that we are exploring or actually undertaking activities that respond to all of the recommendations there. I don't know if you, Matthew, or those of you out there know that Canada has actually been undertaking legal needs surveys for almost 2 decades. And I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Ab Curry, who started the legal needs surveys at the department in the early 2000s, and the most recent cycle, which was done at York University under Professor Trevor Farrow. So a shout out to those and their teams, because we're really just building on that previous excellent work. So we've had different names for our survey over the years, and we're now calling it the Canadian Legal Problems Survey. And very quickly, I'll tell you just a little bit about where we're at. So Statistics Canada is doing the survey for the Department of Justice and other federal departments who are partnering with us on it. The folks at StatsCan have been testing and retesting and testing again the content. We've almost got finalized, and the screen designs were being tested in the territories when the pandemic was declared. At that point, all travel for government officials was canceled, and we won't be going into the territories, rather focusing on the 10 provinces. We have a target respondent of about 30,000, plus an oversample of those who identify as Indigenous. But since March, since the call of the pandemic, the Canadian Legal Problems Survey has been on hold, as have all of the non-mission critical surveys at StatsCan. We're not sure right now what the delays will mean. I do want to talk just very, very quickly about our complementary research to the survey. We're still calling it the Canadian Legal Problems Survey, but they are qualitative studies. And at the moment, we have 12 of these research projects underway, with the 13th in development. And what we wanted to do was to really explore in depth the experience of what we're calling subpopulations, but really specific communities that we would not be able to through this national quantitative study. And these qualitative, almost like little case studies, are going to complement then that national data. So we have 5 different broad communities that include gender and sexual minorities, Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, immigrants, and persons with disabilities. The questions asked will be the same, but they'll be done through a qualitative lens, and the methods being designed by community-based researchers with their community's input. So we're really excited about that aspect, and those studies are still continuing.
Great, thanks so much, Susan. And you touched on this briefly, but I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how you're responding to the realities of COVID, and specifically with regards to survey design and data collection.
Yeah, so right now, as I mentioned, the Canadian Legal Problems Survey itself, the quantitative national survey, is on hold. So we haven't, and because even Statistics Canada employees are limited in their access, so we haven't had a lot of discussions on that. But we actually have been, the qualitative studies, as I just mentioned, are continuing. And we've had many conversations with the contractors who are sort of in the community on the ground about how their method may change, about timelines altering, about the different kinds of questions that we now need to ask, because we now have we're right in it, pandemic period, and then we have a pre-COVID-19 period. And I think on our survey, we've used the last 3 years in order to ask if people have experienced serious problems in the last 3 years. And yet all of a sudden, we're in a completely different time zone, really. And what we have found is, so at least on one study where the interviews have already wrapped up, and about 25, 30 interviews, and they just moved to telephone. And they were with adults with both cognitive as well as some physical disabilities, that it was a really good opportunity to hear what they're going through right now, and whether their problems that they're experiencing are from before and have just been exacerbated, or whether they're new problems actually caused by the pandemic. So just in a nutshell too, we're also exploring a couple different opportunities, couple different ways to capture what's happening right now. We're looking at public opinion research, whether we do that through the department or through civil society organizations like the Association of Canadian Studies that have a weekly poll right now and are oversampling immigrants. So we may look at adding questions on that. And we also, Statistics Canada has pivoted in this way in that they have a new perspective series of surveys that are looking specifically at the impact of COVID-19 on a range of areas like mental health, post-secondary students, and one that's coming out on May 12th is perspectives on personal safety, which is of real interest to the department. And these are different because they're being run through crowdsourcing. So they're getting out there. The first one had over 200,000 responses, and the results are coming out really quickly afterwards. So that's an excellent example of public participation. We'll be asking questions around confidence and trust in the justice system. Our qualitative studies are really ensuring inclusivity in our work and our understanding. And we're just really looking forward to finding out what's happening and how the Canadian public are faring.
Great, thanks so much, Susan. And I see lots of questions coming up around your presentation. So please continue to share those questions and we'll collect them and get to them when we get to the Q&A section of the panel. Turning to legal empowerment now and really learning from a past health crisis, Lydia, can you tell us about the work of Advocate in Sierra Leone and also specifically how it responded to challenges around the Ebola virus in 2014 and 2015? And I think you're muted. There you go.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I would like to just say that this has been timely, particularly for the fact that Sierra Leone is a committed member of the Open Government Partnership and has been since 2013 and has also released its Access to Justice plan from 2019 to 2021. And I know that with the Ebola crisis plus now the COVID pandemic, I know that this is the right time for them to make decisions that informed by human rights approaches. About Advocate has been here since 2006 and provides access to justice services for women and girls in a country caught up in Sierra Leone's often unjust system. We are the only organization in Sierra Leone and West Africa that offers holistic services to people in relation to giving free legal aid representation, education and empowerment, detainee support, social work, but also we have moving forward after detention program, where we ensure that detainees will live as stronger women with brighter prospects. Advocate was one of the few legal aid organizations that continued to work and operate during the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, and was able to share its stay-at-home report with policymakers from its monitoring that it carried out during 2015. And that will be shared on the chat. It will be a resource that will be shared. Advocate during that time was able to continue offering legal aid by having obtained passes for staff during the lockdowns, car registration hire passes, and still offered legal detention, offered legal aid in detention places. But most importantly, intervened for those who are arrested and who breached the lockdown rules at police stations. But this was really people who are vulnerable and the laws were disproportionately affecting them for trying to access basics like water, food, bread, And we continue to document human rights violations and abuses, notably the increase in gender-based violence that increased during the Ebola crisis, to ensure that the risk and vulnerable women and girls received critical legal assistance that they needed. And Sierra Leone, of course, we also worked with making sure that people had access to hygiene items and hand washing sanitations. And thankfully, there was no prison outbreak there was no Ebola outbreak in prison in Sierra Leone. In relation to that, these practices have also been replicated now, even as we are working during the COVID pandemic, ensuring that our work is still sustained, but that there is safety, since COVID is very infectious and does not spread like Ebola. We have distributed steel, hygiene items, and provided various hand washing stations to the police places and prisons that we work with. And we have formulated various forms that are shared with correctional center managers that paralegals then pick them after they have been filled and discuss with various managers for intervention, since there's been restriction to these correctional centers. We also have been able to remotely conduct speaker calls for group interviews and broadcasting sessions with inmates. And of course, with the police, we have insisted and emphasized the application of non-custodial measures, whatever the case, unless they must, to reduce the prevention or outbreak of any form in the cells. So we've been talking to station sergeants to ensure that bail, caution, or any form of resolutions are sorted at the point of contact with police to avoid any crowding and having so many cells filled up to avoid any eventualities. But we've also monitored the lockdown that happened in the previous month, and even the one that recently happened between 3rd to 5th May 2020. We have intervened on behalf of very many clients and people who have been arrested for violating rules, for just trying to earn a livelihood. Maybe the curfew has found them still selling on the streets, and we'll be sharing our report soon with policymakers. Hello?
Great, thanks, Lydia. I'm wondering if you have specific policy recommendations for governments in particular, but also civil society groups that are looking to advocate for specific policies to be responsive to COVID-19 from your experience with the Ebola crisis.
With the Ebola crisis, as well as the COVID pandemic, there has been a state of emergency declared in Sierra Leone for a year, from March 2020. And I know that, of course, there have been a creation of difficult trade-offs between competing public interests, like the right to freedom, assembly, association, movement, liberty, but also due process, which all have to be balanced against the urgent need for the society to be protected against the spread of the virus. So in relation to ensuring just accountability, transparency, and public participation, I would recommend that there should be need, and there is need, for open and transparent communication from the government of Sierra Leone to publish their plans in relation particularly to reduce the risk of COVID in detention places. As you might have heard or read, there was a riot in one of the prisons, the Male Correctional Center on Pademba Road, after one of the inmates tested positive. So if the government could go ahead and publish their plans in how they plan to reduce the risk of COVID-19 in detention places, but also allow access for independent human rights monitoring to be able to access these detention places, because now they are restricted. And also the government to share their plans on how they need to cater for the poor and vulnerable in the communities during the lockdowns. There have been cases where they've been posted on Facebook that there's going to be some cash distribution, but some people are not sure who to go to, where they should find such instances, because these, at the end of the day, are the ones that lead to people breaking the lockdown rules, trying to access food. Then, of course, measures that respond to the pandemic should be all-inclusive. And in this, I mean, everybody in communities, community elders, it should be gender responsive, women, girls, men, community leaders, experts in community should all be involved in ensuring that these responses capture all the voices in all sectors of society so that all needs are catered for to avoid any feelings of being discriminated or disproportionately affected. Then I believe the government of Sierra Leone should, through its various communication and media outlets, inform the people that some of the laws that are regulated and enacted are only in response to the COVID pandemic, and it's for the legitimate purpose of protecting the public health, so that people know that these restrictions are only going to be for a particular time and that they are reasonable, they are proportionate, and of course, they are time bound, so that people know and can be able to know that these are guidelines and regulations that are put in place are a framework that's only operating not against a particular group, but also that it's for the benefit and legitimate purpose of protecting the community and society. I believe also that Sierra Leonean government should go ahead to invite different independent monitors, different CSOs, community leaders who can constantly monitor the human rights situation in the country, so that these reports and data and information that comes from such monitoring is used to inform then decisions that can be made later as they tackle the pandemic. And this would encourage a lot of transparency, a lot of participation, but also that everybody feels that they are involved and the approach is truly human rights informed.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, Lydia. And thanks so much for sharing that critical perspective and lessons and good practices learned from the Ebola crisis. I want to turn now to Waqar in Afghanistan. Waqar, Afghanistan registered a really ambitious UN acceleration action committing to expanding criminal legal aid with the ILF. Can you share a little bit about that activity and particularly how it's been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. Hello to all the panel members and everyone, all the participants. On behalf of the International Legal Foundation in my country, Afghanistan, I am really thankful for having me today in this panel. I would like to discuss 3 important points regarding the question you asked. The first one is legal aid is critical for access to justice, especially for the poor and vulnerables, because we need to develop the trust of the citizen on the justice system. So they will trust on the justice system and they will connect. And secondly, the ILF, International Legal Foundation, established its first office in Afghanistan back to 2003, where there was no functioning legal aid, government legal aid in the country, where we also believe in, it's a part of our constitution that the primary obligation of the legal aid to the poor and vulnerables is the government responsibility. So the government need to play a very positive role, and they should be accountable for that. And secondly, as the legal aid is very broad area, so it's also difficult for the government to work like individually or without any support. So that's why the civil society become partner with the government is really important to further like improve and develop the justice system in the country. As you mentioned regarding the acceleration action plan, yes, as I mentioned, recognition of the legal aid is really important. So that's why the ILF become a partner with the Ministry of Justice, a public-private partnership, in order to comprehensively develop legal aid in justice system in the country. So we jointly, the Ministry of Justice in ILF, submitted an acceleration action to the United Nations in the purpose to develop the acceleration action in submitted to the United Nations in order to see like the commitment, the transparency, and the accountability within the government sector. So they will be accountable for that. So that was like the second important point. And also the partnership with the government regarding that that type of important efforts is really important for the civil society as well. Because according to the new legal aid regulation that just has been approved, we need to promote the Legal Aid High Commission, who will further oversee the government the commitment towards the building the justice system, developing the justice system, and provide access to justice to every individual, poor, vulnerables, men, children, displaced, minorities, in everyone across the country. So that was another important point I wanted to mention. And also from the open government perspective, so it's also important for the government and for the civil society that they need to play a very crucial role in developing the justice system in a country. Where ILF Afghanistan is currently like jointly working with the Ministry of Justice. So on the third part, I would like to discuss and would like to share with you that how the COVID-19 affected like these initiatives or these efforts. So definitely COVID-19, as it was like one of the big concern all over the country. It's the same concern in Afghanistan. The Ministry of Justice locked down during the COVID-19 from almost last 5 weeks. It means almost more than a month. So they do not provide the legal aid anywhere, and they advise to their employees to remain at home and try to take care of their health. So that was one portion. From another part, the prosecution office, the courts, in the detention centers, so they are working. It means they remain open. So that's why the International Legal Foundation decided to have like on duty desk lawyers in order to handle those cases which happens during this time, in even the cases that already remain from the past. It means we have more than 40,000 cases currently in Afghanistan. So these cases need to be reached out. These cases need to be follow up with the prosecution office, with the court, in order to take like right decision to release them. So that was the other important point. And also I would like to share another last point regarding this question. Over the past 2 or 3 weeks, I can say 3 weeks, because of the close work relation with the prosecution office, with the court, hopefully we decreased the rate of the detention center or the detainees almost to 50%. It means when there is cases and they are not serious felony cases, they are misdemeanor cases. So our lawyers, together with the prosecutors and also with the judges, on the right time, within 24 hours, within 48 hours maximum, they reach out and they finalize and they take decision. So yeah, the COVID-19 definitely like affected overall situation, but hopefully we are there, and we still provide legal aid for the vulnerables and for the poor who they need.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much, Waqar. And of course, SDG 16.3 includes an indicator on measuring pretrial detention. So it will be interesting to see how detention rates might change and what happens to those numbers after COVID-19. I want to turn now to Brazil, just in the interest of time and to ensure that we have sufficient time for questions, and welcome Denise Dora. Denise, you've designed with Themis a really impressive project to help domestic violence victims find safety using technology that is really rooted in a collaboration among courts and police and civil society, community legals, paralegals. It's called the PLP 2.0 app. I think you can tell us a little bit more about that and reflect really how it is embracing open government values.
Thanks, Matthew. Well, good morning from Brazil, and I hope you are all well and safe and in your places. And so, yeah, we developed this application in 2014 to deal with domestic violence issues. In Brazil, the Domestic Violence Act was approved in 2006 after a long campaign, 25 years of campaign from the feminist movement. And it has established special courts to deal with domestic violence, as well as special police stations that were in place already from the 90s, the end of the 80s. And coming from an organization called Themis, who works on legal empowerment for women, and after doing so many years of training courses and other programs to empower community leaders to deal with domestic violence, we realized that it was possible, much easier to ask for a cab if you are in your house, than ask for police support if you are suffering rude attack of in a domestic violence context. So we thought, why not? If you have a proper legislation, if the numbers of domestic violence are so big in Brazil and in other countries of the world, why not using technology to also connect it with the police authorities, but also governmental agencies? And that's how the PLP 2.0 has become. We developed an idea that's kind of a circle, because it is connected special courts on domestic violence, the police services, and the community leaders, in a way that a woman who is suffering is in a situation of domestic violence, she can go to the courtroom, and from there, with the collaboration of and support of the Judges Association, the judge downloaded in her cell phone icon. It's an application that connects her directly with the police. And when the police receive the call and respond to it, this flow goes to the community leader in her community that starts monitoring the how and when, and the police come to provide support. We've been testing this model over the last 5 years, and we have been also, and it's in use in the city of Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil. And as you can imagine, it provides a high level of transparency and accountability in the work of the justice system, as well as the public security agencies, which makes things a little bit difficult sometimes, because not always governmental authorities want to have their work being very followed and known by the community. But in the other hand, it helps a lot, because it creates this flow of conversations among community leaders and justice services and security services. What we've been doing in the last years is also share this experience with other states in Brazil. So now there are around 10, 12 other experiences in the 27 Brazilian states with different applications. For example, in São Paulo, the judge gave to the women in the courtroom this kind of a special number, a SOS number, where they can call directly to to the judge and have a plenary once a month of everybody, creating more or less a community of users and of domestic violence service. In Piauí, in the very northeast of the country, there is a different application, but it also creates this idea. I have to say that it's in the moment where we live now, in the pandemic in Brazil, these initiatives are so useful because we see the numbers of domestic violence requests going down because of the difficult to reach the police stations or even to the official numbers, as well as we know that domestic violence is increasing. So we see that numbers are going down and the fact itself, the issue is increasing. So giving women the opportunity to have some level of technological tools, it's a key lesson for domestic violence and access to justice.
Fantastic. Thanks, Denise. So I want to turn us now to questions. And I think that we'll start initially with a few questions for Susan, and we'll group them together a little bit so it's easier for you to respond. These questions come from Gabriela, Carlos, Janet, Marina, and Dexter. And there are about 4 questions that we're clustering here. So the first is around whether you have any preliminary results from the study that you were able to share. The second is around how you're approaching the challenge of continuing the qualitative studies through the current crisis. Folks are also interested in ways in which civil society and NGOs have been integrated into the process of designing the survey and perhaps data collection, and also as subjects. And then finally, a question around the fact that the pandemic might in fact increase the number of specific claims around employment or housing or domestic violence or family disputes. So it also presents issues for people who are getting help and how they're resolving these disputes. And the question is around whether you'll get data that's different in this context at this moment, and thus perhaps inconsistent with pre-COVID trends or issues.
So thanks, Matthew, and thank you to everyone who's sent in questions. They're all really interesting, and I could probably talk all morning if you want. Sorry to the other panelists, but I get very passionate about this work. So I'll try and remember the questions. We don't have any preliminary results, particularly from the survey itself, the quantitative survey, and we're not actually sure when it will go out into the field. It was intended to start data collection in the late fall of this year, so sort of November, and that will obviously be delayed at least by the 8 weeks since everyone has been on house lockdown. So we're not sure when that will happen, and that may go to the final question just in terms of what will be the impact of COVID-19 on terms of the actual information that we're collecting on that survey. And there is a possibility, while it's been on pause, I've been giving some thought to whether we want to introduce a sort of, again, question about problems post-COVID-19, or ask one or add on a couple questions that would help at least differentiate or understand where that impact of the pandemic has come in. But on the qualitative studies, those are definitely going to be impacted. Now, we haven't done those before in Canada, so we actually don't have any trends. We don't have those rich qualitative perspectives from these very specific communities. And we're actually just really excited. We are in the field right now. There was another question about how are we continuing with that? And I think the majority of the cases, there's an academic who is paired with a community or a community-based researcher, and the academics are taking advantage of their research ethics boards at their institutions. And at the moment, universities are prioritizing COVID-19 research, but the REB, sort of the ethics protocols, are still moving through and obviously flagging any concerns. So they're continuing because the contractors that we have are amazing. I know at least one is online at this moment. So a shout out to all of you, because we think that the work you're doing is just really, really valuable, not just in terms of collecting information, but also in terms of reaching out to people who may be at their most vulnerable and isolated, and really providing a way of supporting them. And Matthew, I'm just wondering, did I cover them all somewhat, at least?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much. I also wanted to bring in Arturo Ruiz from the Ministry of Justice in Argentina. Argentina has done an incredible job of justice measurement, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years. It's done a couple of civil legal needs studies, as well as tracking criminal statistics and incorporating its open justice program. So Latoro, could you come in and share a little bit about what's happening in Argentina and your experience both pre and in the midst of COVID as you're thinking about justice measurement in the criminal context?
Hello, everyone. I don't know if you are hearing me.
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Well, thank you. I will switch to. I will try to translate to put the translation, because my.
Very briefly, I want to introduce to you who is President from the Ministry of Justice. On one side, we have also Leandre Rodriguez Pons. That is the person that's the more indicated for on these matters, because he's the Chief of Cabinet to Access to Justice. He is a lawyer, and he has a very outstanding role before his public position, because there was a cause of abuses on religious institutions known as the Próbolo. From the Republic of Leonardo Ruiz Diaz, from the National Direction of Criminal Policy and Criminal Justice. What occurred during the pandemic is that accelerated many policies that we had already been working on, mainly on in the area where I am working, the studies that had been developed or the matters that have been dealt with were changing the focus because of the pandemic and the measures that had to be adopted. So in Leandro's area, there were specific things that accelerated some of the topics they had already been working on. The area of access to justice, what we had been working on is within the frame of commitment number 4, the 4-action plan for open government. And then we had established the unsatisfied legal needs, a little bit of what has been discussed by other of our colleagues from other countries, and Canada was mentioning this. So our survey and what we are trying to apply some of the results of those surveys was to know unsatisfied legal needs of 3 main groups that have been identified by the general population. Those were in poverty population, indigenous population, and handicapped or disabled. we had around 23,000 around the country, and so we were looking at from the Centers for Access to Justice that are public offices. That is where people walks in and talks about their concerns. They could see a package of tools provided by the state to deal with these issues. During the pandemic, we had to extend to other issues non-related to justice, but have to deal with social assistance or relief, what has to do with migration and of identification of individual, because many people might not have documents and many things that started to appear. And so we started to concentrate on those issues as well. So access to justice, we have a technological change in it. As our colleague from Brazil was saying, in Argentina, it so happened that misdemeanors were reduced, but domestic violence increased exponentially. Therefore, the tools that we had adopted, that was a telephone line or hotline, are moving now to apps to try to create a more direct link to the citizen. These are solutions for domestic violence that are due to isolation. I don't know what happens in other countries, but this domestic violence in our favor because of the staying at home policy. So what we are working on that will be put in place after the pandemic is the quality of justice at large. When the pandemic is over, we will try to look for interpreters for justice purposes, not only for different languages, but also for people that have disabilities, so they can have a link with justice that will be more healthy. Because when there's a lack of interpreters, but legal resolutions could be made. So maybe when there is a problem with companies, that there will be decentralized offices, because Argentina is ranking 8th as the largest worldwide, and that leads us that the territory, the logistics in the territory, sometimes is neglected in our scenarios, and it is very important. We are trying to create clear language so that will be simple and inclusive. We want to have quick processes that will enable us to have a quality resolution for the citizen provided by the justice system. Those are the lines of work. We thank you for giving us the opportunity so the ministry could express itself here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Latoro, for sharing those insights from Argentina. I want to turn now to a question for Wakar from Avi, and it relates to what specific measures the government of Afghanistan is using to fast track the release of prisoners during the pandemic. And so, for example, the question is the government supportive of mass release? And I know Just recently, the president of Afghanistan had issued decrees releasing individuals held in pretrial detention in response to the pandemic. So maybe share a little bit more about how the community is working together and how it's mobilizing the decree.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you, Abby, for the question. Actually, the Attorney General Office also released a guidance for the pretrial release. And for the pretrial release, they put some condition. It doesn't mean that massively they can like release everyone, but they categorize who need to be released and who need to be like move forward for the further steps. For example, currently, let me tell you about the committee. There is a committee. On the top of the committee is Attorney General Office from the prosecutor. And then there is the human rights is a member, court is a member, civil society is a member, detention center is a member, in general, prison authority is a member. There is also another member from the president office who will see like the whole system and the whole procedure. For the pre-trial release or the new arrest when it happens, so the committee review like the case. Generally in Afghanistan, according to the law, within 72 hours, the case need to be referred from police to the prosecution office for investigation. But during the pandemic, they decided that within 24 hours, the case need to be referred to the prosecution office. So this is like one part. Another part, when they jointly work on the cases, they differentiate the cases into two categories currently. One is the felony and another one is the misdemeanor. In the felony case, then they again like categorize if it is a senior felony or if it's a, for example, usual or normal felony. And for the misdemeanor, most of the time they try their best to release like those on bells, release on guarantee, or for example, extend their investigation or extend implementation of the court decisions or the release on guarantee. So they use these 5 or 6 like several options for those to determine. In the one who has a serious and critical felony case, that case need to be moved further to the court and the investigation is properly done according to the law. And this doesn't mean, for example, if they release these accused and suspects, they shouldn't be appear to the court after the pandemic like finish or after the situation get normal. So definitely they need to appear in the court. They need to appear for investigation to the prosecution. In the case need to be further moved. So yeah, to be to the point, there is a proper committee, there is proper condition, there is AJO, Attorney General Office, comprehensive guideline, which is like almost in 4 or 5 pages. In the very, I can say in detail, they provided information to the prosecutor how to move on, and especially to the committee. So yeah, there is a proper system. According to that, they move on with release.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Waqar. Next, I want to turn to a guest that we have joining us, Micah De Longen, who leads the Pathfinders for Peaceful and Inclusive Societies justice work, and specifically on the Task Force on Justice. Micah, I was hoping that you could share. The Pathfinders and the Task Force have just done incredible work over the last couple of years on really raising and highlighting the need for addressing civil access to justice and ensuring that both government and civil society are included in that conversation. Can you share a little bit about what the Pathfinders activities are related to advancing justice during the pandemic, and also share a little bit about the new publication that you've launched that addresses that specifically?
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on everyone for this very interesting sharing of information on access to justice. I think, well, let me start by with the publication that we launched about 4 weeks ago. Of course, this pandemic, even though we saw it coming, came very quickly in many countries, and justice systems, both formal and informal actors, civil society, were all, in a way surprised by how quick these measures were taken and thinking about their role. So we did an initial analysis about, like I said, that we published about a month ago, on what the pandemic means for justice actors and delivering justice services, and particularly how you can remain true to these ideas of people-centered justice services in these times. That first briefing is called Justice in a Pandemic, and focuses on the public health emergency dimension of the pandemic. So we distinguish actually three layers. So of course the public health emergency is the one that we're confronted with first. And we've called, for example, for the need to enforce these measures in a fair way, in a transparent way, to involve people in enforcing these lockdown measures. We draw attention to the risk of increased domestic violence. And I think we've heard today some of the examples from around the world, how countries are responding to that. We also keep emphasizing the general need for data, understanding people's justice need, and then using that data to adapt your practices and work practically, evidence-based decision making. And we realize that that's harder in this context, because the regular surveys, as Susan has shared, are they're long-term processes. They have to be adapted. They may be postponed. So what can you do in the short term? And I think it's very inspiring to see what Canada is doing with in that area, but also what the colleague from Advocate from Sierra Leone shared, how they are trying to monitor what's happening and feed that information back into the justice system and adapt ways of working. We're preparing now a second briefing, which will touch more on the economic and financial impacts and what that means. And we think that will also shift our focus a little bit more from the initial questions, which were related to prison population and enforcement of lockdowns, more on the criminal justice side of things, to the broader question of what justice problems people are facing and how they will increase due to this pandemic, people losing their jobs, maybe not being able to pay their rent, risk of evictions, debts spiraling out of control. There's all kinds of new, some are the same, but at a much larger scale. Some are new problems that are emerging. And so we are preparing the second briefing to really try and get ahead of that problem, so that we have some information for justice actors to respond to that, and adjust their services and adapt. And I think we've seen in the health sector that there's this tremendous speed of learning and sharing information, and I hope that we can copy that to some extent in the justice sector. This webinar is a great example. And so for our briefing, that's my last remark. We do invite people to contribute. The first briefing also shared experiences from around the world. So do let us know. And our timeline is about, we hope to publish that about by the end of this month. And all the information is available on our website. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much, Micah, and thanks for all the great work that the Pathfinders and Task Force does. You mentioned gender violence, and we wanted to turn now to Doris Rajan, which I think we've teed up to ask her question over audio. Maybe Adna, you could help.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yes, I just wanted to pick up on, it was great to hear about the innovative approach to address gender-based violence on the app in Brazil. But I'm just wondering, since it's quite evident that the lockdown and quarantine measures is, really critical to curbing the virus, but it's also, as we know, confining women and girls in their homes, where gender-based violence often occurs. So I'm just wondering if there's any other current promising practices or interventions that we know of that are happening globally to address gender-based violence. And I'm particularly interested in women and girls and gender minorities that face additional layers of marginality, such as women with disabilities, refugee women, and Indigenous women in certain places. I guess that's to anybody.
Yeah, sure. Well, why don't Denise, why don't you start with that?
Okay. Yes, thanks for the question. Yes, there is a global movement of building and programming around technology for justice, for access to justice for women in the world. For example, in India, there are very interesting experiences of getting applications to access reproductive health services. In Brazil as well, there are other applications. We work with Laudelina, an app for domestic workers to connect themselves and to create a network in their communities to provide information and also access to justice. In Africa, there are interesting experiences about mapping the worst place for where happening sexual violence, streets, and a way of communicating other people. Say, don't go through this place because there is a construction, and there it has been increasing the number of rapes happening. And so there is a whole movement of getting gender connected with technology for providing access to justice and safety for women, which is super interesting. And Matthew has been a big supporter of it because he is part of this connection process also. And so there are apps in the field of reproductive health and sexual violence, domestic work, and also some work around the right to city, how women has been isolated from enjoying the cities and knowing more about the streets, and which is very interesting. What we see is the assumptions of getting justice for women based in having information, having some level of support and resources, and having access to public services, the three kind of fundamental points of going out of situations of violence and discrimination. At this point of the of the world, we need more than the traditional ways of responding to it. Justice is seen by women from communities as a kind of a marble building, very distant, very difficult. And thinking about bringing justice to the hands through apps in cell phones, which are for most of the population in vulnerable situations, the only way to communicate and get information is very important. It's a kind of it's a necessary step to change the way we see access to justice. And I think we have enough tools and some level of experience to go further in these steps and rethink access to justice under these new frames.
Great, thanks so much, Denise. Lydia, I also want you to respond to that question, and then we have a question that's somewhat related from Pablo, which is asking, given that the OGP guidelines suggest that we fund innovations to provide remote justice services, there's a question of whether things like video may in fact undermine the trust in the justice system in the long term. And specifically reference to a report that shows that defendants were less likely to get community sentences if they appeared on video. So I'm wondering, in your experience of Sierra Leone, both from the perspective of gender-based violence and technology interventions, but also just more broadly, the role of technology and innovation, ways in which it might support or also potentially undermine justice intervention.
Matthew, I have been advised to keep my video off. I hope now you can hear me clearly.
We can. Yes, loud and clear.
Right. I believe that though that has not been has not commenced in Sierra Leone, because we have been trying to see if our legal counsel can be able to represent clients over, video technology, but that has not been happening. I believe in general that the erosion of confidence in the judiciary system is not just restricted to use of technology. I believe if we can engage our communities and increase justice interventions in the local community, I believe that even with technology and having video conferencing shouldn't be able to affect the interventions that the community could have come up with we could have issues. I'm blocked, for example, right now. We could have a situation where there's only audio, or if there's not audio, there can be a way that the defendant's face can be blurred so that the defendant's face or the complainant face is protected for their own safety, and that can still be able to work.
Great, thanks, Lydia. So why don't we now turn to another guest. We have Joanne Wallace from NLADA, the National Legal Aid and Defender Organization, who I think we can bring on by audio or perhaps video. In the US context, a lot of work has happened to be responsive to COVID-19, and specifically increases in investments in civil legal aid from the federal stimulus bills to the Legal Services Corporation. Joanne, could you share a little bit about that experience and how NLADA, as a member organization of legal aid and defender members, has been instrumental in motivating and mobilizing push for a responsive action plan for COVID-19?
Sure, Matthew. Thank you for that terrific presentation to all the panelists. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn from what's happening in other countries to increase access to justice, and it's been great. So I am, as Matthew said, the president of the National Legal Aid and Defender Association, NLADA, and just wanted to share one of our COVID-19 success stories related to financing legal aid. So NLADA had worked with our corporate advisory committee previously and had significant success rallying corporate support for legal aid federal funding generally. So based on that, we recently worked with the advisory committee leadership to write to Congress again, detailing the need for additional federal funding for civil legal aid to address the impacts of the pandemic. And Congress did provide an additional $50 million appropriation for civil legal aid. And we're working now to secure additional federal funding for state and local public defender offices that are also really badly in need of assistance to adequately respond to COVID-19. So historically, the private support for legal aid has been on the civil side. And so we're really working now. More and more corporations and businesses are beginning to address the criminal issues. So we're cautiously optimistic that we can garner that support again. So I would just encourage participants on the webinar to consider ways that you can work with the private sector to advance access to justice in your own communities, and would invite you to review the materials on our website for other ideas. Thank you, Matthew.
Great, thanks so much, Joanne. So we've got a couple of questions from Alvaro around the SDGs, particularly SDG 16, as a roadmap for increasing access to justice and ensuring that countries are addressing the legal needs of vulnerable groups. I'm just wondering, given the prominence of SDG 16.3, the fact that we now have a civil justice indicator, which is fantastic, if any of the panelists want to come in on the way in which that might help to mobilize as an advocacy platform for the work that they're doing, and also, of course, Micah or others, if you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. I would like to weigh into this question. The government of Afghanistan recently passed the legal aid regulation, which has the Legal Aid High Commission. It means an independent Legal Aid High Commission need to be established, and it's already established like a couple of months ago. According to the Legal Aid, the Sustainable Development Goal 16.3, the pretrial, so that is one of the main responsibility in obligation of the Legal Aid High Commission, that they need to coordinate because one of the member of this committee is from the Deputy Attorney General office, as well as the deputy from the Supreme Court. So they are there in according to the SDG 16.3, the pretrial detention. So we already have law, but in the past, especially like the Attorney General office, they do not somehow practice the law or implement the law. But after this, they will definitely, during the pandemic, when they release like the guidance, so they practice that law. And they now knows like how important that is. As you mentioned, and as one of the participants asked the question, collectively work like the government and the civil society in the justice and judicial organs towards the sustainable development goal number 16 is really important. And they need to like draw some of the important like statistic that like the situation currently they are existing and where they would like to go on and how. They definitely need some strategies, some guidelines, some policies, some bylaws. So that was already started in Afghanistan. So like there is a committee who work, ILF also work jointly with the Ministry of Justice, and we support the Legal Aid High Commission, and we support our international experts, local experts support like these initiatives, especially these documents for the Legal Aid High Commission. Then they approve that, and according to those, then like the Attorney General Office in several like different organs that they work together towards this SDG 16. They work jointly and together to implement that. So yeah, we can use like the SDG 16.3 in practice to develop like a roadmap from that, in how like countries respond toward that, how like countries committed to that in order to achieve that goal. So which is really important. Afghanistan like did some basic work in this part, and we hope we will have like more in the near future.
Great, thanks so much, Waqar. So now I want to turn to a couple of other guests that we have joining us. The first who I'll ask to speak is Marlon Manuel, who's from Namati and based in the Philippines. Marlon, Namati is has just recently released a report on grassroots justice in the pandemic through its Justice for All campaign, and also done a recent poll survey of its members, which number I think 6,000 or 7,000. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what you're hearing from the ground and how you've captured that in your recent report.
Thank you, Matthew, and hello everyone. Greetings from the Philippines. I'll talk a bit about the brief, about the policy brief, and then later on we'll discuss briefly the survey, the Justice Challenge, and some of the initial issues that are coming out. First, on the brief, this was launched very recently, and making the point that to ensure a just response and recovery in this pandemic, governments, donors, different stakeholders should nurture grassroots legal empowerment efforts. We are making the point that the work that grassroots justice defenders are doing in this pandemic should be considered as essential service, and these there are two key angles to this proposition. One is that the ability of communities to know their rights will enable them to access healthcare, food aid, unemployment benefits, and other forms of relief, and that is dependent on their ability to navigate complex governmental systems. Second, and this goes into the accountability angle, is that as emergency actions escalate, citizens need to ensure that governments do not use the pandemic as an excuse to entrench unjust or discriminatory policies. So by supporting legal empowerment efforts and protecting grassroots justice defenders, we are promoting and supporting work that is essential to pandemic response and recovery. Related to this, we have launched the Justice Challenge. And this is a quick survey on how legal empowerment groups are coping with and adapting to the current crisis. And it is also a quick needs assessment in the sense that we want to know the resources, the support, the collaboration that legal empowerment groups would need in these very challenging times. The survey is still ongoing, and I will post the link. We will close the quick survey by tomorrow, by the end of the week, May 8th. But we are also complementing the Justice Challenge survey by having regional and thematic conversations around the same questions on the challenges that the organizations are facing, ways of coping with the situation and adapting to enable them to continue the work, and the level of the nature of support and collaboration that they would need. And to your question, Matthew, on what we are getting as initial responses, one is that the government's preoccupation with addressing the health issue makes many services of the government inaccessible to communities. There was a very interesting discussion earlier about gender-based violence, and we are receiving reports not only of the significant increase in the incidence of domestic violence, but also the inability of the police and other government agencies to respond. And in one discussion session, one attendee said the police officers are all busy enforcing the lockdown policies, and nobody is addressing receiving complaints and addressing this issue. So the work of the paralegals, grassroots justice defenders, at this point becomes a critical service that fills in the gap. Now that the government agencies are busy with addressing the health aspects of the pandemic. So these are some of the initial issues. We are also tracking the emerging human rights and justice issues arising from the government actions, emergency powers, suppression of some freedoms, not only freedom of movement, but also freedom of information. So we want to continue the conversation, and I would invite all the attendees. We have more than 200, I think, in our count earlier, to participate in the online discussion. We have opened an online space dedicated to discussion of legal empowerment and justice in relation to the current pandemic. I will post the links to the policy brief, the Justice Challenge survey, and the dedicated online space for discussion, so that attendees can check and participate. Thank you, Matthew.
Great, thanks so much, Marlon, and thanks for posting those resources for participants. We're nearing the end of our time, but before we wrap up, I also wanted to invite another guest, Febi Yonseta from the Indonesian Legal Aid Foundation. The Legal Aid Foundation in Indonesia has been doing a number of capacity building trainings around using technology and remote service deliveries recently. And I wanted to invite Febi to come in and talk a little bit about how they're trying to be responsive, also leveraging tech and data in terms of being responsive to the COVID-19 crisis, and experiencing the good practices that you've learned from that work. Febi, are you with us?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Matthew. Thank you for allowing me to also share about what my organization doing to respond to this pandemic COVID crisis. And with regard to your question, our network across the countries requesting for the needs to have a capacity building program to respond how to better deal with the situation when the social distancing policy is implemented. So the needs is more how to better use of technology in providing legal aid services as well as human rights advocacy. So what we did basically is we conduct a series of training on how to use the digital technology to support legal aid and human rights works. It consists of how to introduce the tools of technologies and digital platform as well as other technology tools in providing legal aid services. We also the training also consists of digital campaign, digital documentation, digital legal consultation, digital fundraising, and legal aid financing, and also digital security. And we have been this is the third times we conduct the series of training. We're still going on, and as a matter of fact, the enthusiasm and also the needs from legal aid lawyer across the countries is increasing, and they want to know more about deepening their skills and knowledge on how to make use of digital technology in that area.
Great. Thanks so much, Febi. So unfortunately, I think we've come to the end of our session and wanted to wrap up. Before I begin the wrap up, Adnan, is there anything you'd like to share from OJP's perspective before we wind down?
Thank you, Matthew. No, I want to thank all the panelists today for really sort of insightful discussions and sharing of recommendations. You know, again, going back to what we said at the beginning, what we're hoping for is that the participants here from across the globe will walk away from this and try to see where some of these recommendations can fit with the work that they're doing through the Open Government Partnership, and try to work on and take what is happening in this pandemic as a lesson to how we can improve our justice services and expand justice for all. And again, appreciate Matthew's excellent moderating, and I also want to acknowledge my colleague Maha Jwaid, who was really helpful in putting all of this together. Again, if you are interested in seeing some of the recommendations on justice that was referenced earlier in the chat, maybe one of my colleagues can repost the policy guide that could be useful as you take the work forward. And also the Open Response, Open Recovery page has a lot of resources across open government themes that are cross-cutting with justice. So I would really encourage you to look at that. But again, thank you, Matthew, and our panelists and everybody that participated today for a great discussion. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care and be well.
You too.